So this is the Nikon 17 to 28 millimeter f2.8 lens for the Nikon Z system, and I've been out shooting with this lens lately and wanted to kind of just share my thoughts about it. So in today's video, we're going to look at the different features and characteristics of this lens and just see how it performs and see how good the image quality is. So I've heard that this lens is actually a Tamron design that's been rebranded to Nikon. And I'm not really sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm sure people probably have their different opinions about that. But for this video, I'm not really going to worry about that. I'm just going to treat this lens like any other lens and see how it performs. And so this review is mostly concerned with how this lens performs with regard to landscape photography, because that's what I primarily shoot. I've also done a little bit of landscape astrophotography with this lens, so we'll get into that as well. So we'll just kind of start out, we'll go over some of the physical characteristics of this lens, and then we'll get into some images and check out the image quality. So as far as the build of this lens, so this lens is not one of Nikon's premium S-line lenses, and it does feel less premium than an S-line lens does, but it definitely doesn't feel cheap or weak or fragile or anything like that. I mean, it does have a more plasticky feel than a metal feel, but overall, to me, it still feels pretty solid. And there's two rings on this lens. There's the zoom ring and a control ring. And so the zoom ring here feels very nice, has a good amount of resistance when turning it. I don't feel like it's gonna move or slip on its own or anything like that. And the control ring on the lens, this can be set to different functions such as manual focus, aperture, exposure compensation, and ISO. And the control ring also doesn't feel too tight or too loose. This lens is also weather sealed, so this is great for inclement weather conditions, which I often find myself in during doing landscape photography. And the other good thing about this lens, it's fairly small and lightweight for an f2.8 ultra-wide zoom. I found the lens to weigh about 483 grams, or just around 17 ounces with both of the caps on. And this lens is also an internally focusing lens, so the barrel doesn't extend or retract at all when zooming in or out. And this lens also takes a very common 67mm filter, so using polarizers or ND filters on this lens is really convenient and easy. There's no image stabilization, or as Nikon calls it, vibration reduction in this lens itself, though a lot of the Z cameras do have in-body image stabilization. And the lens contains 13 elements in 11 groups, and it has 2 ED elements and 1 super ED element to help minimize chromatic aberration. And it also has 3 aspherical elements to help with distortion. This lens does not have any of Nikon's special anti-reflective coatings to reduce ghosting and lens flare, so you know that's something to keep in mind when you're shooting directly into the sun or another light source. And the minimum focusing distance is 7.56 inches at 17mm on the wide end, and then on the long end at 28mm, the minimum focusing distance is about 10.3 inches. And at the time of recording, this lens costs about $1,200 US. So now let's go ahead and look at the image quality. Alright, so here's a bunch of landscape photos that I've taken with this lens. But before we get into those, I just wanted to go over some of the results from these test chart images that I shot. So I just shot a bunch of images at different apertures and focal lengths, just to get a more controlled scenario to examine the image quality of this lens. And so I'll just go over some of the results here. I'm not going to go through every single photo or anything, but I'll go over some of the main results, and then we will get into the real world landscape photos. So just going to start here at 17mm. If you look at the top left, you can see the setting. So this is 17mm at f2.8. And what I want to do here is zoom in at 100%. And at the center of the frame here, we can see that the image looks pretty good, looks nice and sharp. And then if we look over here at the corners though, you can see how much softer that is compared to the center. And look at some of the other corners, kind of the same thing. And I also notice quite a bit of vignetting around the edges. And so that's kind of how this lens performs at f2.8 17mm, but let's compare that with f8 at 17 millimeters. So we have f2.8 on the left, f8 on the right. So I'll zoom into the center again here. And these are pretty close. Both of them are nice and sharp here at the center of the frame. But then as we move out towards the edges, you can see how much cleaner, how much sharper the f8 image is versus the f2.8. So this is definitely good news for landscape shooters who want to use this lens. Definitely very usable at f8. Kind of look around here. You can notice that difference. And we'll go ahead and look at f8 versus f11 here as well. And these are pretty close. Oop. Go ahead and zoom in on the center. I'd say the f8 is maybe slightly sharper, but they're pretty close, pretty neck and neck here. And then the edges, again, it's pretty close. I feel like the f11 maybe is starting to show a little bit of diffraction. So maybe, I would say maybe f8 would be the sweet spot here at 17 millimeters. And then I'm just gonna do one more thing at 17 millimeters. We'll look at f22, and we should see a whole lot of diffraction here, which we do. If you look here, this is f22 on the right, f8 on the left. Notice how much softer it gets at f22. And same thing here at the center. That diffraction's kicking in and we're losing a lot of that sharpness from the lens. But I would say at f8 definitely looks good. Now let's go ahead and move on to 20 millimeters. So I'm going to look at the center here. So this is f2.8, 20 millimeters. Again, it looks nice and sharp in the center. And at f2.8, again, it gets pretty soft here in the corners. It's not the worst I've seen. I've seen other lenses where it just looks really bad at the corners at these apertures. But you know, definitely gets a lot softer. And then just do another quick comparison here. f2.8 on the left, f8 on the right, both at 20 millimeters. Zoom in here 100%, center looks good. And then let's look at some of these corners, and yeah, same thing here. f8, the corners are looking really good. f2.8 looking soft. And then we're also getting rid of some of that vignetting too at f8. And just want to do a couple more comparisons here. Now we'll look at 24 millimeters. We'll compare f2.8 and f8. So zoom in here on the center. And again, kind of the same story. Things look pretty good here in the center. Let's look at the edges. And then yeah, there's another huge difference here between f2.8 and f8. Get some of these numbers. Look how much cleaner these numbers look versus the f2.8. And then one last thing, we'll look at, this is 28 millimeters. So this is going to be the longest focal length of this lens. And we'll look at 2.8 on the left, f8 on the right. Zoom in at 100%. And yep, things look pretty good here in the center. I'd say f8 is actually a little bit sharper than f2.8 at the center. And then at the edges, same story here. Things clean up pretty nicely at f8. So yeah, looks pretty good. Yeah, so that kind of gives you a sense of how this lens performs overall. But let's go ahead and look at some of these landscape images that I've shot. And so we'll look at this first one here. And let me go ahead and reset that. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this first image here. So this is a raw file. And you can see the settings over here. It's shot at 17 millimeters, 0.4 seconds, f8, ISO 64. And for this shot, I focused way back here in the background. And you can see how everything back there looks really good. Looks really nice and sharp. And even these rocks over here, kind of in the more of the mid-ground area, looks pretty good. Now, in the foreground here, it's not looking too sharp for this particular shot because, like I said, I focused way back here. And I didn't end up doing a focus stack for the final image, but this is what it came out like. And you know, I like this image pretty well. I like how there's sort of a leading line of water there that kind of leads you towards the background. So let's go ahead, we'll move on to the next shot. So this one is pretty much the same exact composition. I just did a way longer shutter speed. So this one is 180 seconds, so that's 3 minutes. And what I did for this shot, I have 2 raw files that I used, and we'll take a look at these. So you see how there's this line of shadow right there. So that is actually the shadow from my tripod leg. And I really hate when that happens, when the shadow of your tripod gets in the shot. But anyways, what I was able to do was I had an earlier shot where these rocks were still in shadow. So I was able to kind of blend some of that shadow back in and kind of get rid of that line. So you can't even tell that the tripod was there now. But you know, if we kind of zoom in here on this final image, and you can see how nice and sharp this shot is on these rocks. You can see, make out all these lines. So yeah, I think this lens is, you know, doing pretty good in real world situation. And so the next image is this one. So this is the final edited shot, and this is a two exposure blend as well. So this shot, here I'll just pull up both of these. So these are the 2 raw files that I used. So on the left we have this shot, and this was done at f/22, and I did that to get that sun star. So I used the sun star from this image, but then I didn't want all that diffraction at f/22 that you get everywhere else. And so I took another shot at f/8, and you can see here, you know, nice and sharp over here on these rocks and the grass. You know, everything looks pretty good. Even the bark on the tree there, you can make out a lot of good detail here in that shot. And we'll go ahead, again, we'll look at the final image, the edited image, so you can see how I blended in that sun star. And then we have the rest of the image nice and sharp. Now one thing to note, let me go back to that sun star image here. This is f/22 again. I'm actually going to boost this up, boost the exposure up a little bit, bring the shadows. And I want to show you how there's this lens flare that you can see, kind of green discoloration. You can kind of see it throughout, and then there's also some aberration here that you can see. And so this lens, like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't have any of Nikon's coatings that they use to reduce ghosting and lens flare. So, you know, that's just something to keep in mind. So let's go ahead, we'll move on to the next image, shot on the same evening. So this here is the final edited shot, and this is another 2 exposure blend. So I used these 2 raw files. Again, I shot one of these at f/22, and then this one was actually shot at f/6.3, but you can see I wanted to get that sun star back there. And you can notice how much that diffraction affects the image. If you look here on the left, it just looks so much softer than the image over here on the right. And so I blended those 2 images together and came up with something like this. I think that looks pretty cool. Love how the light's just kind of hitting all this grass right here. And you can see as we zoom in, everything looks really nice and sharp. These rocks down here look good. Go over here to the edges. You know, everything looks pretty decent to me. Alright, so next we have a couple of astro shots. Now, this one was shot at f/4, but I want to move over to this one first, and then we'll come back to this one. So this one was shot at f/2.8. So this is the edited version here, and we'll go to the raw file. Now again, this is a shot at f/2.8. This is a 15-second exposure, ISO 6400, and this was at 20 millimeters. And I wanted to zoom in here and show you how this lens performs at night under the stars. You can see there's a little bit of chromatic aberration, some blue fringing going on. And what I noticed here though is there is a decent amount of coma. So you can see right here, a lot of these stars, they just look like kind of like little miniature comets kind of. You can see that. Now that bothers some people, other people, you know, not a huge deal. It's not the worst coma I've seen on a lens, but you know, it's not the best performance. And if we look at f4 here, this other image. So this was shot 10 seconds, f4, ISO 6400. And we notice that coma pretty much goes away at f4. But really at f4, you know, I don't really shoot astro at f4, like hardly ever. I mean, I did just for this demonstration purposes, but unless I'm on a star tracker or something like that. But if I'm just on a static tripod, usually I'll stop down to, you know, f2.8 or f2, depending on the lens I have, or even 1.4. But yeah, so the second image here, this is the kind of the final edited image here. Take a little peek at that. And so this was a 2 exposure blend. So I used this shot here. This is a 60-second exposure, f2.8, ISO 1600. And I was able to, you know, reduce that ISO a little bit and use a little bit longer exposure to get a cleaner foreground. And that is why this foreground looks relatively clean. I mean, there's still quite a bit of noise here, but you know, if I spent more time editing and cleaning this up, it'd probably look a little better. But yeah, that's how this lens kind of performs with regards to astrophotography. There is some coma on the edges at f2.8. Let's look at this final edited image. Let's go back. So you know, I noticed the coma on the right side here is not as noticeable as it is on the left side. So take what you will from that. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next shot. So this is a waterfall shot, and this is the edited version here. And let's take a look at the raw file. So this was at 28 millimeters, 1/8 of a second, f8, ISO 64. And I'm actually I'll brighten up the exposure just a little bit here so we can see a little better. And as we look at these rocks, you can see a lot of good detail here along the edges. Totally usable image here. I think that looks pretty good. So again, here's the final shot right here. I probably blew out some of these highlights in the waterfall a little bit, so this might be one I have to go back and re-edit at some point. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next shot. So this was shot at f2.8, and this is 25 millimeters here. A little bit higher ISO, 320, and we have 1/640th of a second. So this is the final edited version. Let's go over to the raw file right here. And so I focused here on these pine bristles, and you can see like, that looks really good. Super sharp there. And now if we look at the kind of the nature of the bokeh here, it's not the most buttery smooth bokeh in the world. You can kind of make out these bokeh balls there and stuff. Yeah, it's not super creamy, but you know, it looks okay from a global standpoint, I would say. Let's go back to the edited file. And here we are. We have nice sharp in the center where I focused on these bristles. And let's go ahead and look at the bokeh here as well. All right, next image here is this lake. And so this is the edited version. Go ahead and look at the raw file here, and zoom in. See, everything looks really good back there. Even the silhouette looks pretty nice of these trees. And so where did I shoot the settings here? So this was at f11, 1/200th of a second, ISO 160. So let's go back. Look at the edited version here. You see how everything looks pretty good. See a bunch of people back here. A lot of people on this particular day. But if we look at the mountain there, it looks nice and sharp. All right, next shot is this one. So this is the edited shot here. And this was a 3 exposure blend. So I used one image where I exposed for the sky. And then I have these other 2 raw files here where I focus one down here. You can see how much sharper it is in the foreground here. And then on this other one, I focused in the back so you can see how it's sharper there. So this is also a 13-second exposure to smooth out that water. And blending all those together ended up something like this. And you can see we got a lot of good detail here. A lot of good detail with that lens and in the background as well. Things are looking pretty good. Now I am kind of noticing with these trees a little bit of distortion. If you kind of look towards the center, the trees are more vertical up and down, whereas as you get to the edges, they kind of lean towards the edge a little bit. I mean, that's pretty common with wide angle lenses. And this is something you can kind of fix in post. If you use Photoshop, you can apply some perspective, warping, things like that. And let's go ahead and got a couple more shots here. Where's the final one? All right, so this is the edited shot right here. And this was also a focused stack. So I used these three raw files to focus stack to this one file here. And if we kind of look, we get pretty good image quality here. Nice and sharp. Yeah, looks good. And then this last image. So here's the edited version here. And here's the raw file. So this is 1.3 seconds, f9, ISO 64. This is at 19 millimeters. And I think somebody had thrown like a stick, had a bunch of snow on it. So like the ice was starting to form on this lake. And you just have all these little bits of snow and rock and stuff on top of the ice. So I just kind of use that as a foreground for this shot. So this is the edited version here. Kind of zoom in, everything looks good. Nice and sharp here in the foreground. And even back here looks pretty good. Not perfectly sharp back here because I focused on the foreground in this shot. And it wasn't a focus stack. But again, I'm seeing some of that wide angle distortion here with the trees. This is actually a good shot to kind of demonstrate that. So you see how these are more vertical, and then as we move out, they kind of start leaning a little bit over to the side. Same thing over here. They start kind of leaning over. So there's that wide angle distortion. So overall, I'd say that this lens does perform pretty well for landscape photography, especially when you're stopped down to f8. And for landscape astrophotography, it's definitely nice to have the ability to shoot at f2.8, even though there's some coma and fringing that occurs at that aperture. But I do think that the 17 to 28 millimeter range is very useful for wide angle photography. And it's nice that this lens remains relatively small and lightweight, you know, especially for a f2.8 zoom. You know, the other 2.8 zoom from Nikon is the 14 to 24 f2.8, and that lens is definitely better in many ways, but it's also heavier. It takes those huge like 112 millimeter filters, and it's like twice the price. You know, but actually one of the main drawbacks for me with the 17 to 28 millimeter lens is the price. I mean, for $1,200, I feel like we should be getting like a higher quality S-line lens, but hopefully that price will go down over time. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But if you end up getting this lens, I do think you'll be happy with it because it is capable of capturing some amazing detail. It's not overly heavy. You know, it takes those smaller 67 millimeter filters, and it can be nice to have that f2.8 for certain situations. But anyways, that's it for now. I'll see you guys on the next video.